Korea is now at a critical juncture on the nation's trade front as Japan looks set to slap further export curbs against Seoul soon, while U.S. President Trump is giving out fresh warnings to the WTO to stop providing advantages to countries with strong economy, which include South Korea. Today, we go in depth on the tough external circumstances Korea faces and possible ways to tackle the issues with Dr. Jun-sok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. It's always good to have you with us.
Happy to be here.
South Korea's Trade Minister Yoo Myung-hee, after wrapping up her trip to Washington, said the U.S. government officials as well as the U.S. industry agree that Japan is setting a dangerous precedent. She also said that America's major business organizations, including the Semiconductor Industry Association and the Information Technology Industry Council, have sent a joint letter to both Seoul and Tokyo urging the nations to quickly resolve the issue. How influential are these business associations?
Well, 6 business associations signed this letter to the Japanese government and the Korean government saying we should work this out. And the largest group which signed the letter is actually National Association of Manufacturers. In the U.S., that's a group of all manufacturing companies. So it has the widest representation, and it's a very powerful organization in terms of lobbying and making influences on U.S. trade policy as well as domestic tax and industrial policies. So that's the biggest group that's been involved here. It includes Fortune 500, Fortune 500 firms as well as SMEs, so it's quite a wide representation. And then the second most powerful group is probably the Semiconductor Industry Association, the SIA, as you said. It includes the major players in semiconductors, IBM, NVIDIA, Micron, as well as Intel and AMD. Another group which is interesting is Consumer Technology Association. It's about a group of 2,200 firms. They're famous for putting on consumer electronics show in Las Vegas every year, the CES show, where it gets coverage even in Korea. So they are big organizations. They are big lobbying companies, so they have a lot of influence in Washington, D.C. The problem is they did not necessarily send this letter to Washington, D.C. They sent it to Korea, Seoul, and Tokyo, Japan. And it's not entirely clear how much influence it'll have on their governments. If these organizations, as well as sending a letter, pressured the U.S. government, the U.S. State Department, and the Trump administration to do something, it may have an effect. But as far as effect on Korean government and the Japanese government concerned, I'm not too sure how much influence that they will have.
So these are quite big name, influential business associations, but you're skeptical how much impact it'll have
outside the United States
on pursuing the Japanese government. Trade Minister Yoo Myung-hee also stated that Seoul has requested Tokyo to hold bilateral talks at the upcoming Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership meeting in Beijing, but Japan rejected the request. How do you analyze Japan's stance?
Okay, well, Japan has been very cagey in a sense that they're officially, legally separating the trade matter with the Japanese reparation issue. But they have been giving a lot of signals that these are actually tied in. Now, Korean position is we want a negotiation on trade, but not on the reparation issue. Because it's been set by the Supreme Court of Korea, and the government, the executive branch, cannot do anything about it. Japanese obviously feel differently. Now, on the Japan side, they're refusing all negotiations on the trade front, but they want a negotiation on the reparation front. So unless both sides give on both sides of the issue, I'm not sure if there will be a I'm not sure there will be negotiations. They may hold the negotiations separately, but they have to be, I think, part of a packaged issue. And the way that the national sentiment is going in both countries, not just Korea, but Japan as well, I'm not sure if they're ready to have negotiations on both issues at the same time.
The Korean government plans to continue letting the world know about the unjustness of Tokyo's unilateral export curbs against South Korea on global stages, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership meeting and the ASEAN Regional Forum. How do you assess our government's efforts?
Okay, well, I think this is best that the Korean government can do in the short term under the current circumstances. We are pursuing the case in the WTO. But WTO dispute settlement takes 18 months to 3-4 years, so it's not going to have any effect on the short term. Probably the best weapon that we have in the short term is trying to pressure third countries to get Japan to stop these trade restrictions. But on the other hand, because Japan is tying this to their security issue, and even if other countries think that this, Japan tying the reparation issue to the security issue is unfair, I'm not sure if the other countries will want to have their hands tied when they get to security issues. I'm not sure if other countries would want to give up chance to the ability to make their own whitelist if they want and take countries in and out if they feel that these countries are dangerous to their security concerns. So even if they feel that it is just, I'm not sure how much support they'll give to Korea in order to put a more strict control on which countries can put, how countries can put on countries in the whitelist or not. So having said that, it's going to be very difficult for Korea, but I think Korea has managed to convince virtually all countries that this, the reason that Japan is putting these trade restrictions are not because of economic reasons or security reasons, but because of trade, the Japanese forced labor reparation issue. So I think, in a sense, Korea is succeeding on that. I think the Korean government is succeeding in its effort to convince other countries that Japan is being unfair, and it's using this tool not in the way that it's originally intended. Having said that, though, I'm not sure if they'll be very effective in trying to limit the Japan's ability to put countries in and out of their whitelist. I think right now the focus should be on, even if Korea gets off the whitelist, we get the required chemicals and intermediate materials on time without too much of a hassle.
Now, speaking of Japan's whitelist, Japan it's almost certain now that it's highly likely to pass a bill on Friday that removes South Korea from its whitelist of trusted trade partners. How do you gauge the impact, the possible impact on the Korean economy?
Okay, well, if Japan uses the whitelist to actually limit or ban exports of these crucial items, then that's another problem completely. But let's just assume for a second that Japan does what it says internationally, and it takes Korea off the whitelist, but it still processes the list and releases the exports reasonably on time. Then it'll take about 90 days for the process to get through, and that will reduce flexibilities for a lot of Korean companies because they will need to apply for these goods 60 days beforehand, and they will need to incur additional costs to fill out the paperwork and any other requirement that the Japanese government may have. So Korean firms will be less flexible, and in these days of global supply chains, if you're less flexible and you cannot guarantee the arrival of the intermediate parts at your customer's door by a certain time, that'll reduce your competitiveness quite substantially. So it will affect Korean firms even if Japan does process the whitelist promptly. So that is a problem. And obviously the best effort that Korea can make is to get Korea back on the whitelist or not have it leave at all. But I think that'll be very difficult, especially in the time remaining.
Now, going back to the existing trade restriction against Seoul, it's almost been 1 month since Japan slapped those restrictions on against Korea on key high-tech materials, and we haven't seen one single export approval since then. How much longer do you expect our Korean firms to wait, and is there any possibility Japan might not give approvals at all, citing procedural issues?
Okay, well, before Japan slapped this restriction on Korea, we knew that if country went off the whitelist and they had to process the paperwork, it'll take up to 3 months. So I think 3 months is about reasonable time that we can give to see whether Japan is processing the paperwork promptly or not. Now, on the part of Korean firms, we are testing alternate materials, alternate chemicals which are from Russia and China, but I think that'll take more than 3 months to process. The reason is that we have to test these new chemicals from Russia or China or even from Korean sources to see if they meet the test of purity. It has to be 99.999% pure. But some of the people I've talked to who have knowledge of engineering said that that's even not enough. That 0.001% impurity, even that impurity has to meet certain standards. And that's what's really difficult about using chemicals from sources outside of Japan. And that'll take 1 to 3 months to test. And even if they're found acceptable, they have to be adapted into the production process. That'll take additional few months. So the best solution here is to get the chemicals from Japan. That'll hopefully give us enough time to develop domestic sources. But it's proceeding very slowly.
But you do expect Japan to give a green light after the 90-day period?
That is questionable at the moment. What Japan has said to international press, New York Times, Financial Times, is that they will process the paperwork promptly, and if the export is to be used for strictly civilian purposes, then they have no reason to delay processing. Now, that's what they said to American and European press. What they've said to Asian and Korean press, the Japanese officials, is that unless you do certain things, including try and come to negotiation for Japanese reparation issues, there's a good possibility that they will not process the paperwork. So we'll have to see which side of the promise they carry out. Right now, it's a bit of a wild card, and I think this is why Korea's diplomatic efforts are so important, because if Japan does turn out that they will not process the exports promptly, then the international press, international diplomatic community, as well as the world, will know that Japan was lying. So I think that's why the diplomatic effort is so important.
Now, Korea is striving to produce key high-tech materials using homegrown technology as part of efforts to reduce dependency on Japanese imports. How are things looking on that front?
Okay, as I mentioned before, it'll take months to get through the testing process. And it's the impurity, the quality of the impurities, it's slightly paradoxical, but the quality of the impurities that are really important here. And that apparently takes a lot of time to check. And even if these chemicals are found acceptable, it'll take months to use them in Korean manufacturing process, adapt them into the Korean manufacturing practices as well. So if Japan does not release the goods on time, then there will unavoidably be some cuts in domestic production of semiconductors. So that's a big concern right there. There's another concern, which is that if additional goods go on the whitelist, then there are other processes where Korea is very vulnerable. The places which the goods which are continually mentioned are things like carbon fibers and parts for hydrogen batteries, which are crucial for Korea's initiative to develop hydrogen power. So that's another front that can become a big problem if Japan widens the restrictions under the whitelist.
One quick last question for you. We're running a bit out of time. U.S. President Trump is gearing up to cut WTO benefits to a number of countries, including Korea and China. Of course, he's mainly targeting China, but Korea is also included among those countries labeled as developing countries. Could you explain to us about what those benefits are? Okay,
well, under the WTO rules, when there's a negotiation for a new round, advanced countries have to cut their tariffs by a wider margin. They have to give up certain privileges like emergency safeguards for agriculture, and they have to give up a lot of subsidies as well. Korea has one of the highest tariff rates for agricultural goods in the world. Korea is still taking advantage of declaring itself a developing country when it comes to agriculture. Every WTO country right now has the right to do that, and Korea maintains the right to use the agricultural safeguard. But as long as the new negotiation doesn't start, Korea can still operate under the old obligation, so it will not hit us right now, even if President Trump does succeed in making WTO change the rules for developing countries. However, they may hit certain countries bilaterally and unilaterally. And Korea, I think, is a bit out of a danger for that because we have signed the KORES FTA, and we've reduced the agricultural tariffs under the FTA, but there are still some certain goods, rice, as well as garlic, sesame, that still has, even under the FTA, high tariffs, and that might be a bit more vulnerable, but Korea is not as vulnerable as I think a lot of people fears.
All right, thank you as always, Dr. Yang, for your insights tonight.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of News in Depth. From all of us here at Arirang, thank you for watching.